The question regarding a redemption arc is this a good story to tell, and is this a good arc for the characters? And the answer that stories like this give is a resounding, who cares? So I've had a bit of a bone to pick with redemption arcs for a while. Oh, really, Lily? That's totally surprising. Shut up! The 2010s were absolutely obsessed with them, and they got old very quickly. In the wake of my critique of the sheer avalanche of characters that were getting hastily rushed redemption arcs throughout the decade, the same refrain we always hear came roaring back. Oh, but it works! If it's done well! It's a pre-programmed response, I fucking swear. But it's true, redemption arcs work when they're done well. So why aren't they ever done well? In the 2010s, there was a renewed glut of redemption arcs in animation, largely fueled by a compulsive desire among many people to fix bad or otherwise vile people. Either this was ideological, where someone sincerely believed that nobody was bad and they were just broken and that if you can find what's wrong with them, you can fix them, or, more commonly, horny, where someone just wants to fuck the villain and has severe daddy issues making them chase after bad boys and girls, and that's about it. As they became more popular, I began referring to them as Snapshot Redemptions, where the redemption arc it doesn't actually happen. The villain mostly just says, okay, I'm a good guy now, and everyone else is like, okay, I believe you. To say this isn't fun is an understatement. I can't imagine the kind of person for whom this kind of redemption is fun, but they probably live in a cave and subsist on raw fish. In a redemption arc that works, I'm not going to say good because this is the bare minimum amount of quality, the point where a character decides to atone for their actions and the point where they can say to have been redeemed are two different points in the story. There's an entire second act in there that is crucial to that redemption process. Now, villain fuckers will call this notion puritanical and based on Catholic values, but in reality it's based on one very simple concept. It's satisfying to see character work toward goal. Every good character wants something. They have a motivation. A redemption arc is a fundamental shifting of that motivation. They want to change, and it's satisfying to see them work to get it. But a bad redemption, and indeed every bad redemption story, ignores this concept and instead has those two moments happen at the same damn time, skipping over that entire arc.
I met this lawyer, we went out to dinner, I had the lobster bisque, we went back to my place, yada yada yada, I never heard from him again.
But you yada yada over the best part.
So instead of lazily going through examples like I normally do, I figured this time we'd be a little more comprehensive and go through as many examples as possible, or at least until I get bored. Starting with the earliest that kinda kicked off this particular version of the redemption arc trend. Riku is simultaneously patient zero and the gold standard for modern redemption arcs. When you think back over it, Riku's crimes are ultimately very little. His biggest crime is being taken advantage of. Throughout Kingdom Hearts 1, he's manipulated and abused by Maleficent and made to believe that his best friend has abandoned both him and Kairi. And before he can really do anything about it, he gets possessed by Ansem and is forced to watch as Ansem uses his body to attack his friends. Ultimately, he gets dropped into the realm of darkness with King Mickey at the end of the first game. Then throughout Chain of Memories, Riku spends his time trying to contend with the fact that the darkness is extremely potent in him, and he's afraid of using it again because Ansem has become a part of him and he always risks becoming him once again. Chain of Memories ultimately sees Riku being put on a path of real redemption, as despite being a victim, he has unwittingly aided in Master Xehanort's schemes. Riku doesn't come into his own as a heroic character until Kingdom Hearts 2. Hell, in Days, he's practically a villain to the villain protagonist because he's ultimately looking to save Sora, and he doesn't really care about how Roxas and Gideon have to die for that to happen. By the end, he has to become Ansem in order to incapacitate an angry and vengeful Roxas. This creates a problem for Riku, however, as now that Sora is awake, he can't go back to him looking like that, and so he avoids him for the entire game until Sora corners him in the world that never was, in what is perhaps the most saccharine moment ever put in a video game.
Close your eyes.
Riku! It's Riku. Riku's here. I looked for you.
Come on, Sora. You've got to pull it together.
I looked everywhere for you.
Throughout all of this, Sora never held any ill will towards Riku. Concern maybe, but never hostility. In the early games, there's this almost tragedy to them fighting. Sora knows that Riku's being played, but Riku either can't or won't see it, but by the end of the second game, once he has his own body back, long story, don't ask, him and Sora fight Xemnas together. It's a really triumphant moment for Riku, especially as he's mastered using the darkness without succumbing to it. But the best part of this is that we're still not done. In Dream Drop Distance, Riku is ostensibly the main character, and his experiences have made him distrusting, cautious, and wary of traps. The opposite of Sora, who blunders into an organization trap. Riku's lessons from his experiences have made him much wiser and far more cunning, and it's because of this that he gets elevated to Keyblade Master. What makes Riku's redemption arc work is that the point where Riku turns on the bad guys is the first game, and that arc isn't complete until Dream Drop Distance. We spend a lot of time with Riku as he learns from his experiences, breaks the hold Xehanort has on him, and comes out a better person for it. It's a good story, and part of why it's so good is because it's long. It's a long story. It arguably takes up the majority of Riku's story. It's only in Kingdom Hearts 3 where that arc can be said to be completed. You get to see every step of Riku's journey, and even if you didn't get to see every step, it's still a journey. Okay, so I am loath to include this one because I've made my case in the past that Zuko is neither a villain nor is his arc a redemption, but honestly, if you think about it, neither is Riku, and I haven't really discussed this aspect of his character. Namely, Zuko, like Riku, has a journey. It's called the entire second season. Zuko's quasi-villainy, like Riku, ends after about one season, and the entirety of season 2 is about him as a refugee throughout the Earth Kingdom, seeing the effects of his father's war that had previously been hidden from him. The war's been going on for a century, and for the Fire Nation, it's always been something going on somewhere else. Everyone in the Fire Nation, especially children, are propagandized to, and Zuko's involvement in the war has been on a Fire Nation patrol out in the sea, but now Zuko gets to see firsthand the result of that war, the effects of a century of imperialism done by his family. Both it and his uncle's words have thoroughly humbled him, and while he does relapse, his experiences are going to stay with him and he can't really go home again after that. It's a poignant moment in the story where Zuko wants to return to his old normal, but he can't. And once again, part of why it works is because it has time. It has a lot of time to really work through everything and have an actual arc. It's more about recovery than redemption, as Zuko isn't ultimately at fault for the crimes of his father, but as the prince, it's his responsibility to fix them anyway. What's this? Lily Orchard being positive about Steven Universe. Perhaps I should check to make sure the sky isn't falling and the sea isn't running red with blood. Well, you insufferable cunt. I've always been positive about Peridot. I've always felt that she and Season 1 Garnet were the best characters in the show. In fact, the point where the show went off the rails were the sidelining of Peridot, as well as that weird story arc where Pearl rapes Garnet and apologizes by saying she couldn't help it and Garnet was so stoic and she just wanted her to step on her. That was a weird few episodes, and I still want an explanation for that. Anyway, Peridot is another one of those not redemption stories where it's less about redeeming oneself for evil and more about deprogramming oneself from authoritarian bullshit and learning to appreciate the little things that make life worth living. It's a relatively long and satisfying arc as Peridot learns to be her own person, and one of the few stories where Steven is actually genuinely kind to someone. Once again, this is all about one key element: time. Time that the other quote-unquote redemption stories in Steven Universe just don't get. As the show went on, Steven developed a lot of control issues, the good writers left, and all that was left were Sugar and her weeb forum. Okay, Lily, I'm noticing a theme here. Oh, are you now? Yeah, the theme for good redemption arcs is time. Now, admittedly, the Kingdom Hearts games have more cutscenes than an entire phase of the MCU, so let's have a look at something a little smaller. While Sunset Shimmer of Equestria Girls didn't have a redemption arc, she still had time after committing to changing. At the end of the first Equestria Girls, Sunset expresses remorse for her behavior in the first film, which was bad. The first one wasn't very good, okay? But the entirety of Rainbow Rocks is about dealing with all of that. It unpacks what was going on through this kid's head and how she has to address being on the other side of the fight this time around, as it's ultimately her against the Dazzlings. Still the best set of villains that the series had, honestly. And that's it. It's not very long, but it's as long as it needs to be, and at least it gets some attention. Wait, Gideon Gray, Lily, that guy had like 2 scenes. I know, but we're getting even shorter to make a point. See, I talk about time, but an even more important element is care. You can establish an off-screen redemption arc, but you need to know how to do it. And I think Gideon is really the most efficient at it. When we first see Gideon, he's this school bully who has a serious racism issue, mostly directed at himself, ironically. This guy has parents who just really fucking hate themselves. When we see him again at the end of the second act, he's gone through a change.
I'll be darned.
Hey, Judy, I'd just like to say I'm sorry for the way I behaved in my youth. I had a lot of self-doubt, and it manifested itself in the form of unchecked rage and aggression. I was a major jerk.
Now, you don't get to see how he got to this point, but if you listen to the way he talks, you can infer it.
I had a lot of self-doubt, and it manifested itself in the form of unchecked rage and aggression.
Stuff like self-doubt and manifesting in the form of unchecked rage and aggression isn't the kind of vocabulary that a country boy would normally use. And indeed, he doesn't in any of his other speech in the same scene.
Hey, kids, don't you run through that Mindy Camp and Holly Sethias.
Well, now there's a $4 word, Mr. H. My family always just called them night howlers.
Gideon's been to therapy. Something happened to him in his life that caused him to realize he had a problem and needed to change. Probably got himself in a lot of trouble and was either forced or strongly encouraged to go to therapy and get help, or maybe he just realized one day that he wasn't happy and needed help and then got it. It's a small scene, but it says a lot about a character whose main crimes are mostly just being a bigoted moron, and it largely leaves it to the audience to clue into those things. If you know anything about therapy and about how rednecks talk, you'll get it. And there we go. That's a character who exists in 2 scenes, and it says so much about his life in just those 2 scenes. It's very good. Okay, Lily, those are all good, but what makes all the ones you say are bad different? Oh, I'm glad you asked, incredibly sexy stranger who just happens to be voiced by me. In contrast to Gideon Grey, Andy DeMayo spends an entire episode of Steven Universe being your racist uncle at Thanksgiving, but most of his character development has to be dragged kicking and screaming by Steven's evangelical blood is thicker than water beliefs. Side note, don't tell me what the phrase originally was, that anecdote is not true and you're annoying regardless. To the point where they chase him down in a plane and then all of his anger and bigotry vanishes into thin air. He just jumps to being your weird hippie uncle like nothing happened. Now, there's actually a lot to unpack about that one family member at Thanksgiving nobody talks about and barely tolerates, particularly in how nobody outside of Greg really takes him to task about any of his bullshit. Your racist uncle at Thanksgiving is a problem, but a bigger problem is everyone else at the table who doesn't tell him to shut his ass up. But none of it gets talked about because Steven Universe is not a show that tells racists to shut the hell up. Instead, it's, but family! Okay, I'm no longer a Trump sucker. I imagine time was not good to this episode because it came out after Trump was elected, which was just the catalyst for a lot of people to kind of stop tolerating a lot of their conservative friends and family members. It's not really a redemption or even recovery for him. It's an episode about reaching across the aisle to your racist Uncle Andy. And the reason why it ultimately doesn't work is because it's a story written by your racist Aunt Becky. That's a smaller scale. Your racist uncle is evil, but he also probably never leaves his house, so at least he's probably not assaulting people who matter. It's on the larger scale where this becomes a problem. Simply put, there's no coming back from genocide. Once you flip that switch, it's pretty difficult to justify redeeming a villain guilty of genocide that isn't just surrendering and submitting to justice. Admittedly, there is exactly one way to do this, and that way is this narrative decision was fueled by writer bigotry and therefore should be summarily ignored. I don't need to be coy here, you know exactly who and what I'm talking about. But in most other cases, it's really an instance of trying to have your cake and eat it too. You want the villains to be a threat because drama, but you also don't want to kill them because you have the moral framework of a 5-year-old. At that point, there's really no option other than to say, there's hell, you better jump. This was ultimately the case with the Diamonds. They've done so much and hurt so many people, and yet the show ultimately piled on excuses to justify not destroying them, and their redemption was little more than, hey, stop being evil, Mr. Hitler. Admittedly, early on, they were largely shrouded in mystery, the only real sight of them being the murals on the walls of the secret Nazi moon base. But the more you learn about them, you learn they don't like gems fusing, don't like gems getting sentimental, attempted genocide against every gem on Earth, and they engage in mass slaughter of any gem which comes out wrong or doesn't fit the rigid idea of what a gem should be, which is not fascism in the same way prison labor is not slavery. But in the end, the fascist regime is defeated with a, comeback.
You're just acting like a child! I am a child. What's your excuse?
Ah, if only the Allies had known the devastating secret weapon of no you, it would have shortened the war by 5 years and saved millions of lives.
If I lay this card down, I can flip any situation around. It goes bam. Uno, reverse card.
The Diamonds never really see any kind of arc. They show up barely for the sake of hype and ultimately only get 5 minutes to come around. The next time we see them, they aren't so much on a redemption path as they are aggressively simping for Becky's self-insert.
Just let us adore you.
I swear the early design documents for this were for a visual novel dating sim set in Spandau Prison. The ideas start with big, tall, step-on-me mommy villains and end with Steven patronizingly talking down to grown women like they're children, and the story ultimately yada-yadas over the space between point A and B. This is the fundamental problem. It doesn't want to kill the villains, but it also can't be bothered to spend the time or even the energy necessary to redeem them, and that's even before you get into how shaky ground it is to redeem genocidal dictators in the first place. When I think about redemption arcs, I'm drawn to think about the people who say that the Owl House doesn't get good until Season 2, mostly because Season 2 adds all the adventure fantasy garbage modern fandom is obsessed with, but part of the reason it works is because Season 1 did all the actually good character work. It seems like a lot of people want to yada yada the character work and just get to the part where their favorite hunky murderer gets to be on the good guy team, which would make sense because if there's one thing I can call most of the writers of these stories, it's single-minded, lazy, and way too horny for their own good. Lily, that's 3 things. I like to go above and beyond. This is the simplest reason why all of these redemption arcs are so shit. For the sake of rising tension and max thirst, the villains have to get progressively worse and worse to keep you watching. And then when it's time for the redemption that was decided early in production, nowhere near the amount of time is spent on that redemption as was spent on the villainy. That is not a workable story. See, I've never hated redemptions, I've just gotten very tired of bad redemption stories. Characters having to rethink what they're doing, unpack the terrible things they've done and why, and actually trying to be better people is extremely compelling. I mean, that's basically my primary professional ambition right now. I can relate, to an extent at least. It's a general running problem of the stakes getting more serious, but the ethical framework of the story not following along with it. Reminds me of how My Little Pony starts with the framework of friendship can solve any problem, which is fine when your ex from camp comes back and yells at your girlfriend, less so when some weirdo starts trying to rewrite the very fabric of reality itself so she can rule as an oligarch, and even less so when other nations are about to go to war with each other. It tries to continue tackling more and more adult problems while still using the framework of a child. And speaking of this framework, a common refrain is that it's not a bad thing to teach children to know that people aren't born evil and can have their minds changed, and while in a vacuum this is an okay lesson, in practice, like everything else, it's reductionist. In the same way fandom likes to present one particular set of tropes as the best and only way to do something, they also apply this framework to real life. Just because people can have their minds changed doesn't mean that they will. It harkens back to that problem of left-tube and debate bros and their obsession with recruiting and de-radicalizing. While you can de-radicalize some Twitter ghoul, that doesn't mean you can de-radicalize anyone. People who get de-radicalized by debate bros were never really radicalized to begin with. Their political engagement was largely retweeting, voting, and nodding along to footage of a coup attempt. Those people are not politically engaged, and a YouTube video can nudge them left. That is assuming you are not also the same kind of Twitter ghoul, which is not something you can guarantee from LeftTube. But basically anyone more committed to right-wing politics than just watching debates like soap operas isn't going to be swayed, like at all. But that fantasy continues to exist. A lot of people want to be Daryl Davis, just without the massive risk to their own personal safety. And I feel this is why redemption arcs are so frequently poorly written. There needs to be a real care given for all the characters involved, both the villains themselves and the people they've hurt. Are you making a good decision with this that follows the good through line for the villain in question? Or are you just ruining what was previously a fun and menacing villain that was already building up to a confrontation that now feels anticlimactic? The question regarding a redemption arc is this a good story to tell, and is this a good arc for the characters? And the answer that stories like this give is a resounding, who cares? They don't care if it works for the character. They just want the catharsis of living vicariously through the idea, and what makes a satisfying story doesn't really matter to them. Redeeming villains because they think they can, and that because they can, they have to. It's part of an ongoing boiling down of stories to merely being lists of tropes like they're a fic on AO3. They don't care if it works or not as long as it's there, especially when it's in service of guilty thirst. I'm not the first person to point out that the rise of self-described villain fuckers who simultaneously want a nasty, evil, bad white boy to thirst over, but also want him to be a poor little meow meow so they can thirst over them guilt-free, because for whatever reason, the people in fandom who have the darkest and edgiest tastes are also weirdly insecure and think everybody else is judging them for it. And when you're working from that contradictory framework, there's a bias toward making your villains as nasty as possible for as long as possible for max humiliation fetish, and then very quickly walking all of it back at the end so you don't have to have an uncomfortable conversation with yourself. It would be an understatement to say these people have a fetish. It covers the whole spectrum of redeeming the giant woman in heels to sexy cat girl tortures her crush to actual hybristophilia. The difference between someone who simps over Kylo Ren and someone who simps over Ted Bundy is the same as the difference between asking your partner to spank you and asking your partner to actually break your arm. The same fetish at different extremes. This is the entire reason true crime is so popular with people, because after a while, fictional villains don't provide the same thrill, so they look for real people and treat it like fiction. They will inevitably treat a real person's pain, suffering, and misery the same way they treat a fictional character's, as a vector for their entertainment. It would not be unfair to call this attitude selfish, especially if left unchecked. This isn't to say that anyone who wasn't bothered by the diamonds or Lilith is going to turn out to be the same level of deranged as the women who dressed up as Ted Bundy's victims to voice support for him at his trial in front of those people's families. I think it's actually easy to tell, if you will, honestly. Are you regularly whining about purity culture? If not, you're gonna be fine. But I think the way many otherwise good tropes get co-opted by fandom and fetishes is something worth talking about, because redemption arcs are good, but whatever this is sure as hell isn't a redemption arc. You know, I started talking about what makes a good redemption arc and started seriously unpacking why we moved away from it, and I didn't think I could connect Andy DeMayo to true crime ghouls, but apparently that's a skill I have now. Well, I'm fucking tired, I'm going to bed.